All right, thank you, praise team, and we appreciate them coming in each week and singing for us and leading in the songs. And again, I am so thankful that you have joined with us on this live stream and to be a part of this. And again, you are a vital part of what we're doing here as far as this video is concerned. And so again, grateful. We are in our study in 2 Corinthians, and we are now up to chapter 5. And so I hope you have your Bible there. It's 2 Corinthians chapter 5, and we're going to look here at the Word of God. And again, I've enjoyed our study in 2 Corinthians, and we are, again, big section. Paul's defending his ministry here. He's talking about the ministry of reconciliation, and not only what that means to us, but why this ministry is so vital and why this ministry is so important. So let's look together, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. In verse 1 he says, "For we know that our earthly house of this tabernacle were dissolved. We have a building of God, a house not made with hands, but is eternal in the heavens. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house, which is from heaven, if so be that being clothed we shall not be found naked. For we that are in this tabernacle do groan, being burdened, not for that we would be unclothed, but clothed upon, that mortality might be swallowed up of life. Now he that hath wrought us for the self same thing is God, who also has given unto us the earnest of the Spirit. Therefore we are always confident, knowing that while we are at home in this body, we are absent from the Lord, for we live by faith and not by sight. But we are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. Therefore we labor, that whether present or absent, we may be acceptable or accepted of Him." In this passage, there's a lot of hope, right? A lot of encouragement. These are very comforting words. Because here Paul is talking about the resurrection, right? And I'm going to be honest with you, when we started this study in 2 Corinthians a couple months ago, maybe 3 months ago now, I was hoping that we would be at chapter 5 on Easter. Well, as you know, Easter was like 3 weeks ago, so there's a little bit of a delay there, but you know, I'm going to blame it on the COVID-19 virus. Okay, I can't blame the virus, it was just me, because this is the passage that really talks about resurrection. It talks about hope. It talks about laying down this body. It talks about how we lay down the tent and we have a more permanent dwelling place. We have that resurrected body, okay? So there is this tent, but there is this house, this earthly house, but there is something better that is very simply eternal. I don't know, when I read this passage, there's a Southern gospel song that came to mind, right? You know what I'm thinking of, which one it is? Think about it a minute. Yeah, that's it. Ain't gonna need this house no longer, right? Ain't got time to fix the windows, ain't got time to fix the doors, ain't gonna need this house no longer, right? I'm getting ready to meet the saints. And that's how we feel. And I think that's how we should feel. And we're gonna look at this passage, and really, that's really what it's about. It's this old house is decaying. It is temporary compared to what is eternal. And in fact, as we look at this passage, that's really what I want us to really notice. I want us to think about. I want us to think about and notice how the temporary is compared to the eternal in these verses. It's almost as though Paul says this is what's temporal and this is what is eternal. And he wants us to compare the two. And ultimately, we have to make a decision. Where's our focus? Are we focused on the temporary, or is our mind and heart set on the eternal? Because this goes a long way in how we live our life. And this goes a long way to helping us engage in this ministry of reconciliation, how God is renewing all things through Jesus Christ. So let's think about temporary compared very simply to the eternal. Now let's go back a couple of verses from where we read. In fact, let's go back to chapter 4, verse 16. Okay? And you remember, last week we looked at, Paul refers to himself as a clay pot, and God has placed this treasure, His presence, His glory, Jesus, within this clay pot. And really anything we do in ministry, anything we do that's good, eternal, is really, it's the work of God. It's what God is doing. Okay? And so Paul wanted them to understand how God had delivered them. It wasn't him, it was God. Anything in their ministry, his ministry, it was God. It wasn't him. It's not his power, but it's the power of God. And then we looked here, he says, for this reason we're not fainting. We don't give up. We're not going to faint. Okay? But then notice what he says, but though the outward man perish, yet the inward man is being renewed day by day. And so already we begin to see this contrast between temporary and eternal, right? The outward man perish. What's that? Temporal. Okay? But the inward man is renewed. What's that? That's eternal, right? What's in you is eternal. What is in you is the Spirit of God. What's in you is that you are a new creature, okay? What is in you, very simply, is by God, and it's eternal. So we already see this comparison between temporary and, very simply, what is eternal. Now let's look at the next verse. For our light affliction, which is but for a moment, worketh for us a far more exceedingly and eternal weight of glory. Again, notice here the comparison. Okay, he's making this comparison, and notice what he's comparing. He's comparing, very simply here, affliction with glory. Okay, affliction is what we experience, our difficulties here in this life as we seek to serve God. There's going to be obstacles, there's going to be difficulties, there's going to be struggles. And Paul mentioned this. He was knocked down, despair, and all the things that Paul mentioned. But he's comparing the afflictions of what we're going through here in light of what? The glory. Okay? The glory. So here's this comparison, but then look what he does next. He says, but this affliction is but for a moment, right? That is, it's temporary, right? But the glory that waits is what? It's eternal. It never fades. It never goes away. And I love this. He says, our afflictions, what's going on in our life right now, he says, it's but for a moment. Do you know what that means? What that means is that the temporary will end. The struggles, the difficulties, the things that we're going through in this life will end. They will end. Okay? And very simply, what God is doing, eternal, will never end. Get it? Never end. Okay? I mean, that to me, I love that. It will end. You know, here we are in this quarantine, right? And some say, well, what are we going to do? When are we going to come back? You know, I don't know, but let me tell you, if we could just get an end date, if we could just get the end in sight, I mean, even, you know, if we come back next Sunday, great, or if the governor decides we don't need to come back till the end of May, that's okay too, because we can endure, just as long as there is an end in sight, right? We can endure, we'll just keep going, as long as we know that this is not going to go on forever. And I think that's kind of the way should be about life, right? That very simply, the afflictions we're going through are but for a moment. They will end. But what is eternal, what God does, will never end. And you've got to see that. And then notice he compares light and weight, or slight affliction, versus something that's really, really heavy, something that's more permanent. And I think that's the comparison there. So you see very simply what is temporary, and we see what is eternal. And he says what is temporary is but for a moment, okay? And because it's for a moment, we can endure. But what is eternal is what? Is going to last forever, okay? You see the comparison. Now, what's interesting in this verse is what he puts in the middle. He says that this light affliction is but for a moment, but it's working for us a far more exceeding and eternal weight of glory. Now, that's kind of confusing. What does that mean? Well, let me share with you the ESV. And he says, for this slight momentary affliction, and here it is, preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. Okay? So what God has in store, there's nothing in this life, nothing that even begins to compare, okay, with what God is doing. But I want you to notice this, preparing for us. What does that mean? Well, here's what it means. This is passive voice, which means it's not something we're doing, but it's something God is doing. It also has the idea of continual action. In other words, God is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory. Okay? In other words, it's not us. I'm not getting credit because I'm suffering. It's not about me and about what I'm doing. But what Paul wants us to know, very simply, that in the midst of our slight affliction, in the midst of our light affliction, this which is temporary, God is working. Okay? God is already preparing, and so in the midst of our difficulties and struggles, God is preparing for us already something glorious that is beyond all comparison. Okay? And so there is, in this temporary, there is eternal. God is working. God is presently working. And what God is doing, now get this, what God is doing is eternal. It can't be stopped. So here's the point, guys. What is temporary cannot stop or hinder what is eternal. Okay? What is temporary doesn't hinder the eternal. In other words, even though in this life there's struggles and there's difficulties, you need to know that in good times or bad, it doesn't matter, because the reality is what God has determined and what God is doing will not stop. It will not be hindered by this life. It will not be hindered by what is temporary. But what God has promised is eternal. It is going to last forever. It is sure. It will happen. Okay? And so this temporary life will not hinder the eternal. A lot of people think, well, maybe all this suffering, sometimes people think that all this suffering means that maybe God doesn't love me. No. Okay? That's not it at all. So what you're going through in life, guys, you need to know that already in you right now, God is working. So what you and I experience in this life, the difficulties, the struggles, this light affliction, God is already preparing for us something eternal, something better. Now let's look at the next verse. He says in verse 18, "And while we look not at the things which are seen, but at the things which are not seen. For the things which are seen are temporal, but the things which are not seen are eternal." Right? So here again, here's this temporal, eternal thing, comparison. But he says here, what is temporal are the things that we see. Right? The things that we see all around us. Okay? This world, the earth, the cravings of the earth, the pleasure, all of that comes under this category is temporal. They are things that we have seen. But notice, but the things that are not seen are eternal. In other words, there are things that God is doing. We may not see them. Okay? We live by faith, not by sight. And what he wants us to know is that, guys, you can't look at what is seen and try to determine what is eternal. Okay? You can't get so focused. Let's do it this way. You can't get so focused on what is seen that you forget about what God is doing, or that you fail to see. And so the reality is, guys, we need to see what we can't. We need to see the unseen. And we need to stop focusing on what we do see. We can't let the things of this earth, listen to what Paul says, "For while we look not on these things which are seen." What does that mean? What it means, Paul says, we're not focused on what we see. We're not focused on the things round about us. We're not focused on the struggles. We're not focused on that. But our mind is what? Is focused on heaven. Okay? Our mind is set on heavenly things. And I think in all of this, guys, the contrast here is, what are you looking at? Okay? If you're so focused on the temporal, you're so focused on things, you're so focused on comfort and worldly aspirations, you're so focused on these things, don't let that blind you to what is eternal. Because God is there. God is working. God is very active in our lives, as we saw in the last verse. Even in our difficulties, God will never leave us. God will never forsake us. Let me give you an illustration from the Old Testament. In 2 Kings chapter 8, Elisha, the prophet, there is a story there where the king of Syria is coming against the king of Israel. And the king of Syria, he's crafty and he plans traps. But every time he plans a trap, the king of Israel evades. Okay? He escapes or he goes a different direction. And the reason the king of Israel does this is because Elisha told him there's going to be a trap by God using Elisha, right? And just making that known. So the king of Syria, after he figured it out, he can't catch, he went to his cabinet, his leaders, and said, okay, we have a traitor. Somebody is telling the king of Israel what our plans are. And his cabinet member, they come back as servants and they say, no, Lord, we're not. But there is a prophet of God. There is this man called, that's name is Elisha. And Elisha is telling the king of Israel what we're doing. And so the king of Syria, here's what he does. He says, okay, take a host of men, a large army, and he says, I want you to go find him. Where is he? And they say, well, he's in the city of Dothan. And so they say, well, okay, go to the city of Dothan and capture him. We need to stop him, right? And in this story, they march through the night. They have chariots, horses, and they have this huge army, and they surround the city, right? They just literally surround the city. There's no way out. There's nothing anybody can do. The next morning, the servant Elisha wakes up, he looks out there, and he sees the enemy, the king, he sees the Syrian army. They're all around him, and he goes to Elisha, and he says, Elisha, he says, we're going to die. What are we going to do? I mean, look out there. This is it. And Elisha says this. He says, no. He says, there are more of us than there is of them. Can you imagine the servant like looking to Elisha, did you have a bad night? What do you mean? Look out there. There's people everywhere. And then Elisha prays. He says, Lord, let my servant see. Okay? And God answered, and God opened his eyes, and what he saw was the unseen. What he saw beyond the valley on the mountain range all the way around was horses and chariots of fire. What he saw was the army of the Lord. Okay? He was so focused, what he could see, he panicked. But when God opened his eyes, he could see all around. He found joy. And that's what we got to do. That's what we need to see, guys. We need to understand. We don't focus on what you see. Guys, don't let the world define you. Your identity is not in the world. Don't get so bogged down by what you see. Don't get so bogged down by temporal things that very simply it blinds us to what is eternal. Get it? Don't let the world become your home. Don't let the world so blind you that you fail to see the unseen, the eternal. You fail to focus and see what God is doing, what God is preparing. Guys, don't limit God to what you see. Don't limit God to what you see. Okay? Because what you see is not the whole story. It's temporal. Okay? So don't judge God's love and mercy based upon things and what you see. And that's what we do, right? We think, well, I've got plenty of things and plenty of comfort. God must love me. And when it's all gone, then so God, no, that's not it at all. Guys, God loves you. And his love is eternal. But don't measure God's love based upon the temporal things. God's love is God. It is what he's done in Jesus Christ. So don't let the temporal things blind you to what God is doing, to what is eternal. Now let's look at the next couple of verses. Verse 1 of chapter 5, right? And this is where we read a moment ago. For we know that if our earthly house of this tabernacle or tent were dissolved, that we have a building of God and a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Again, here it is, right? Temporary, eternal. We've seen this in the afflictions. We've seen this when he talks about what we see. Now here we are. In our earthly bodies, he refers to them as a tent, right? I started to make another video on a windy day to grab a tent and put a grandkid on it and just let him parachute off. But anyway, I don't think his mother would have allowed that. But anyway, you get the idea, right? Tent is temporary, right? It's temporal. It's not like home. But notice again, we're dissolved. Okay, there it is. That this body is temporal. It's going to fade away. The outward man is perishing. It's going to dissolve. But when it does, he says, we have a building of God, designed by God, made by God, created by God, a house not made with human hands, but and he says it's eternal in the heavens. In other words, we're going to lay down this whole body one day, but when we do, we have a resurrected body, a glorious body, a body that is fit for for eternity. Even though it's in the heavens, you understand, guys, that the end goal here is not that we're all going to go to some place. We think about going to heaven, but the reality is we're coming back to earth, right? God's going to make a new heaven, a new earth. You understand that? And when we come back to earth, it's important that we have a body, okay? It's important that we have a body. In fact, notice the next verse. For in this we groan, earnestly desiring to be clothed upon with our house, which is from heaven. So, okay, it's a heavenly body. But notice this, he says, for we groan, earnestly desiring. Isn't that interesting? Okay. In other words, we are in this body, and we long for the resurrection. We long for that day, right? That is the work of God. That is very simply what God is doing in us. And the reason that we groan is because of the Spirit. We groan because this is the hope. And the fact that you groan means that eternity is already working in your heart and in your life. Now Paul says, if so be that being clothed, we shall not be found naked. That is very simply unclothed. Now that's kind of an interesting phrase, right? What does that mean? And I think what Paul is talking about, being clothed and being found naked, probably has something to do with the worldview of the people at Corinth. Not only just at Corinth, but even in the Roman Empire. Their worldview of what happens after death. Where does the spirit go? And it's influenced by Greek philosophers, Greek mythology, but most of them have this idea that the spirit just continues to exist. It just goes to another place, or it comes back to one big spirit. Some had the idea that the spirit would even remain here on earth. And you look at some of the Roman tombs and the way they're built sometimes had that idea that the spirit would remain in this tomb, and their tombs begin to look like little houses, and all kinds of different ideas. And I think that this is what Paul is talking about being found, because none of them had the idea of a bodily resurrection. They all had the idea of that you would be a spirit somewhere or something, it varied. But their idea was that the body is what hindered the spirit. The body is what kept them from reaching this utopia idea, right? This state of perfection. And so their idea was to negate the body, get rid of the body. And so the idea of adding a body to that in the afterlife just didn't compute with their worldview. But I think here's what Paul is saying. Paul is teaching something new in the gospel. He's teaching the resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? And he wants them to know that very simply, and he dealt with this. You remember back in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, when they asked the question, what kind of body is it going to be? And you remember he dealt a lot with there about this issue. And this is what Paul's bringing back. Guys, remember, we're not going to be spirit beings just out there somewhere. But the reality is we're going somewhere. Not only are we going somewhere, but in the resurrection, in the reconciliation, in what God is doing, demands a body. Okay? God is renewing all things. God is, in this ministry of reconciliation, God is renewing all things, making it back to His original intent, all the way back to the Garden of Eden. And so in that, what God is going to do, He's going to give us a glorified body, a new body, a resurrected body, and very simply, a body that is what? That's eternal. And so here's what Paul says, for we that are in this tabernacle do groan. Okay, there's that idea again. Our longing, our desire, being burdened, being hindered by this body, but not that we would be unclothed. Again, we're not going there, The point of all this, guys, is not just simply to get to heaven, okay? The point of all of this is that God is reconciling all things, okay? And so Paul mentions here we want the clothing that this mortality will be swallowed up in immortality or be swallowed up in life, okay? And so what Paul is doing, he's saying, guys, when you're a spirit, separates from the body, it's not just out there to find its own way. It's not just out there in some, far off land or traveling this old earth, No, what Paul is doing is giving them hope. What Paul is saying, guys, you're going to have a body, a resurrected eternal body, a permanent dwelling place made by God, created by God, fit for all of eternity. That's our hope. That's what we see in Jesus. That's what happened in Christ on the third day when he came forth victoriously. And Paul says very simply, he says, this is what's going to happen to us. We're not going to run around naked. We have a hope, and that hope is very simply is what God is doing, very simply is eternal. Now, he that hath wrought for us, God that is doing this, okay, God has made this promise. Notice what he says, who has also given us what? The earnest of the Spirit, the down payment of the Spirit. Guys, again, the reason that we groan is the Spirit. Right? The reason we long for a resurrection is because God has set eternity in us. Eternity is already working in your heart and in your life. You're a new creature. You are born from above. And God has placed His Spirit in you, the Spirit that is eternal. And this Spirit, as we saw in Romans 8, teaches us, compels us to groan. As we see, it mentioned the earth and believers, and the Spirit groans, shows us, reminds us that, guys, there's more to life than this temporary. There's more to life than what we see. There's more to life than this old tent. But there is something better. There is something that is eternal. And that's what we long for. That's why we do ministry. That's why we exist. Because eternity is set within our hearts. Okay? So, understand, let's look at the next verse, or the point, temporary will end. Guys, this body will end. The temporary, the things that you see, all the things that you have been chasing in this world will fade away. Temporary will end. But the eternal has already begun. You're already a child of God. You are already a joint heir with Jesus Christ. And whatever happens in this life, whatever affliction, whatever goes on, you need to understand that, guys, your hope is in Jesus Christ. It's eternal. It will not fade. It is eternal. Okay? And already your citizenship's in heaven. We're going to look on in this chapter, and Paul's going to use this phrase that we are ambassadors for Christ. That's it. This world is not your home. You have within you that which is eternal. Your spirit, your soul. And the Spirit that has convinced you, the Spirit that has witnessed to your spirit, that causes you to groan, to desire that which is eternal. And that's why many of us, we say, man, I can't wait. Right? I can't wait. We get to heaven, I won't need a haircut. Right? And I get to heaven, I won't need all these vaccines and all. No. But you know what? It's more than just escaping life, the earth, right? It's really about seeing Jesus. It's about being with Jesus. And that's what the Spirit does right now. Eternity has already begun. And that's what we can rejoice. And that's the Spirit, that earnest, that down payment that will one day be fully realized when we receive this resurrected body. So Paul says, therefore, we're confident. Paul says, we got to confident. We're not going to faint. We're not going to quit. Why? Because it's not about the temporary. It's about what's eternal, right? And it says, knowing that while we are at home in this body, we are absent from the Lord. Paul says we understand this. Okay? We are temporarily separated, right here. But listen to what he says, but we walk by faith, not by sight, right? In other words, our focus is not everything we see, it's faith, it's the promise, it's what's inside of it, it's that eternity is set within us. So look what he says. We are confident, I say, and willing rather to be absent from the body and to be present with the Lord. You know, as I was reading this morning, I was thinking about some of our church members right now who this day could be true. They're going to be present with the Lord. And that's the hope, isn't it? That's it. And so we're confident. We know that when that day comes, and this is our desire, this is that Spirit's groaning, is that one day we'll be in the very presence of the Lord forevermore. Okay? So, again, you know, when I looked at this chapter, I kept going back to chapter 1, in 2 Corinthians chapter 1. And you remember when Paul described something that happened to him in Asia, that he was at the point of death. He knew that death was set. He said that we're going to die. And he said that in that moment, his emotions failed him. His wisdom failed him. His philosophy, his psychology, all of that failed him. He said he had nothing left. But God gave him comfort. And you remember what he said? He said the one promise that gave him comfort was that God raises the dead. That's it. That's the promise. And I think that's what Paul wants us to see. So don't allow the temporary to become the most important thing in your life. But it's about the eternal. So let's look back at some of the things that we've seen. The temporary doesn't hinder the eternal. In other words, God is already working, right? Preparing for us eternal way to glory. And even though there is suffering, even though there is difficulties, that will in no way negate God's purpose and God's plan and what God is doing in your life. So the temporal doesn't hinder the eternal. Okay? So the second thing, don't let the temporary blind you to the eternal. Guys, don't get so focused on what you see. But see what the unseen. See what God has promised. See what God reveals through His Spirit, through His Word. And that's what we need to focus on, because that sets our mindset, our pattern for life, our obedience. Guys, we get so focused on temporary things that we worry, we're overrun with fear. No. Keep your eyes on what God has promised and what God is doing. Okay? Don't let the temporary blind you, but see with faith that God is eternal and what He's promised is eternal. What He's doing is for all eternity. It will not fade, but everything we see is temporary. And then notice, the temporary will end. Yeah, thankfully, right? It will end. I'll lay this body down, this old tent. I ain't going to need it no longer, right? But I have already within me that seed, that spirit, my spirit, Spirit of God that's eternal. So already eternity has begun. Eternity is within us by the grace and by the Spirit of God. So let me end by asking you two questions, okay, in light of what we've looked at. Are you guilty of pursuing the temporal or temporary while ignoring the eternal? Only you can answer that. Are you guilty of pursuing the temporary? Are you so caught up with things of the world that you are ignoring God's promises? Are you so caught up in things that you see? Are you substituting the temporary for the eternal? Are you clinging to things? Are you clinging to the love of the world, the love of money, the pride of life? Are you clinging? Does this become more important to you than what's eternal? I think it's a question we all need to ask. I think it's a question that we need to answer. Let me ask you another question. Why would we pursue the temporary when the eternal is so much better? Why would we let our lives get so bogged down in worldly concerns and worldly riches and worldly ways? And all of it's just going to fade away. It's just going to go away. It's going to be destroyed. And only the things of God will last. Why would you pursue all of this when what you have right now in you, in the Spirit of God, in Jesus Christ, what you have right now is so much better? Why would you pursue? Why would you ignore the things of the world instead of the things of God? I think that's a question we all need to ask. It's a question I need to ask. It's a question you need to ask, but more importantly, we need to answer. We need to look deep in our hearts and ask ourselves this question: why am I here? What am I living for? What's my hope? Where's my treasure? Is it temporary things? Or is it truly that which is eternal? The faith, or very simply, the just shall live by faith. Right? We live by faith, not by sight. This is part of this ministry of reconciliation. This is why Paul was so eager to tell everyone that there's a hope. There is so much more than what you see. The struggles and the difficulties are nothing compared to what God has done and what God is doing.